July 5th, 1941. London, England. The whir of machines echoed through the cavernous halls of the engineering office. Amidst the clattering of typewriters and the murmured conversations of engineers who had long since learned to tune out the hum of a war-torn world, a single piece of paper sat on a desk, an innocuous blueprint. It was just another revision of a design that had been rushed through in the frenzy of war, as if speed could save them from their enemies. But on this blueprint, a small flaw had been discovered, a flaw that could cost them everything. John Watkins, one of the senior engineers, stared at the paper, his brow furrowed. He had spent countless hours studying the new naval artillery system that had been hastily approved to arm Britain's fleet. The weapon was supposed to give them an edge in the upcoming battle against the Nazi forces, but the blueprint suggested something else, an error in the weight distribution of the naval gun's firing mechanism, a flaw that, in a matter of months, could lead to catastrophic failure during a battle. The weapon could jam mid-fire, or worse, explode. The problem was clear to him. It was obvious, undeniable. But as Watkins glanced around the cluttered room, at the other engineers hunched over their own desks, the gnawing sense of helplessness began to creep in. No one else had noticed it. No one else had raised the alarm. They were all too busy trying to meet the deadlines, to deliver, to please the higher-ups in the Admiralty who were too concerned with keeping up appearances and winning the next battle rather than fixing an unglamorous flaw in a piece of machinery. And that was the problem. It wasn't just that no one noticed it. It was that they were not allowed to notice it. They were not permitted to raise questions. Every minor hesitation or suggestion was seen as a weakness, a sign of doubt, an impediment to the machine that the military and government were so desperate to keep moving forward. The war was all-consuming, and in that rush for progress, there was no room for uncertainty, especially not when lives depended on those decisions. Watkins sighed and rubbed his temples, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He knew what this flaw meant, but he also knew what would happen if he spoke up. If he raised the issue to his superiors, it would be dismissed. There was no time for changes now. No time for second-guessing. The ships needed to be ready. The war needed to be fought. History was moving forward at a breakneck pace, and no one wanted to be the one to slow it down. He stood up, pacing in the small, dimly lit office. The quiet chatter around him continued, unaware of the crisis unfolding just a few feet away. It was as though the world was unaware of the storm that was building in the shadows of these offices. Watkins glanced at the clock, watching the seconds tick away. Every passing minute meant the war was moving forward without them. He had to decide quickly. He grabbed the blueprint from the desk and stuffed it into his briefcase, a sense of urgency beginning to replace his doubt. He couldn't ignore it. Not this time. The men who would be relying on this weapon would have no idea that their fates were being sealed in a series of calculations and overlooked details. They would board those ships, sail into battle, and they would trust that the engineering behind them was sound. And if they did, they would die. As he walked out of the office, his mind raced. He knew that once he presented this flaw to his superiors, there would be no going back. They would either listen and fix the problem, or they would ignore him and risk the lives of countless sailors. He had to take it to the Admiralty, to the men who had the power to make the decision. But he knew that in the world of military command, the voice of an engineer was as easily ignored as the ticking of a clock. It was a world that operated on status, on connections, not on the cold truth of mechanical failure. Watkins made his way through the labyrinth of hallways, his footsteps echoing against the stone floors. He passed by colleagues, all busy with their own tasks, their faces etched with the stress of wartime. They didn't know what he was carrying with him, the truth of potential disaster. They didn't know how fragile everything was. To them, the war was just something that had to be won, no matter what it took. But to Watkins, it was a question of survival. For the first time in his life, he was unsure whether it was the military that would win the war, or whether it would be the very mistakes they ignored that would bring their downfall. He arrived at the Admiralty building, where the air was thick with the tension of a world on fire. As he made his way through the entrance, he felt the weight of the system around him, an impersonal bureaucracy designed to churn out victory, regardless of the human cost. The men who worked here were all too eager to take credit for the victories, but none of them would want to face the consequences of a failure like the one Watkins feared. He handed the blueprint to the officer at the front desk and waited as the papers were passed along. It was only a matter of time before he would meet with one of the higher-ups who would decide his fate, and perhaps the fate of an entire fleet. He felt a knot in his stomach. In this place, where power and politics played as much a role as engineering, the truth was often the first casualty. What was he even doing here? He had no right to challenge the decisions made by men with far more authority than him. Yet the problem he had uncovered was undeniable. The officer returned shortly, informing Watkins that the Admiralty would review his findings. There was no immediate action, no sense of urgency, just a polite nod to acknowledge that his concerns would be considered, eventually. Watkins' heart sank. He had been ignored. In a moment of bitter clarity, he understood that the flaw he had uncovered was too small to be of any real concern to them. The machine of war would grind on, and whatever happened to the men on the ships, it wouldn't matter. They would not change their course. They would not listen. Watkins left the Admiralty building, a cold shiver creeping down his spine. He had done what he could, but in the end, it wasn't enough. His voice had been swallowed by the roar of history, drowned in the noise of a war that cared little for the individual. The clock kept ticking, and the ship sailed on. Whatever would happen, would happen. The question lingered in his mind. Could a single voice really change the course of history, or was it destined to be drowned out by the roar of progress? August 12, 1941. Portsmouth, England. The sea mist hung low over the dockyard, its gray fingers creeping over the metal hulls of ships that seemed more like ghosts than vessels of war. The constant hum of the engines, the creak of rigging, and the orders barked out from officers barely registered in John Watkins' mind. His focus was on the task at hand. His earlier efforts to present the flaw in the new weapon design had been dismissed with bureaucratic indifference. Now, the clock was ticking, and the fate of the fleet rested in the hands of a small group of engineers who, unlike the suits back at the Admiralty, still believed in the weight of their responsibility. Watkins stood at the edge of the dock, his eyes scanning the ships that would take part in the upcoming naval operations. He could already picture in his mind the crews on deck, the naval guns firing, and the terrible moment when one of these massive weapons would fail under the pressure of battle. The worst part? They wouldn't even know why. It would be just another tragic loss in the blur of wartime statistics. Another failure of engineering that would go unremarked, swallowed whole by the chaos of the war machine. He couldn't accept that. With the last of the sunlight fading, he made his way toward the engineering department, a quiet but determined pace guiding him. He had come to a decision. He was no longer going to wait for permission. He would take the problem into his own hands. It was, after all, the only way to make sure the flaw was addressed before lives were lost. Watkins knew that in the military world, if you waited for approval, you might as well be waiting for a grave. In the dimly lit engineering workshop, he gathered the small group of engineers who had, like him, seen the issue but had remained silent for fear of their careers, their reputations, or worse. Now, they gathered like conspirators. "All we need is a few hours," Watkins said, his voice low but unwavering. "I know how to fix it. I've thought it through. If we can make these adjustments before the fleet sets sail, we might just avoid a catastrophe." There was an uneasy silence. These men had spent their lives under the watchful eye of the Admiralty. They had been trained to follow orders, to maintain the chain of command, to respect hierarchy. Challenging the system wasn't something they had ever considered, until now. They looked at Watkins, at the blueprint he held in his hands, and then at each other. Could they really risk it? Could they afford to defy the very institutions that they had pledged their lives to serve? Finally, it was Bernard Jenkins, a quiet, meticulous engineer known for his practical mind and wariness of rash decisions, who spoke. "We could be court-martialed for this," he said. "What if we're wrong? What if the flaw you're seeing is just a mistake in your calculations?" Watkins shook his head, his voice tight with urgency. "I've been over it 100 times, Bernard. This isn't a mistake. I've run the numbers. We're talking about a failure that could get hundreds of men killed. Do you want that on your conscience?" Jenkins didn't respond immediately, but his eyes flickered with doubt, his sense of loyalty warring with his growing discomfort. It was then that Harry Miller, a younger engineer with more enthusiasm than experience, spoke up, his voice shaking slightly with excitement and fear. "It's not just about us, is it?" Harry said, looking at the others. "It's about what happens when we don't do something. How many lives are we letting slip away just because we're too scared to act? It's either we fix it or we let them die." The words hung in the air like a weight. No one spoke for a long moment, the silence stretching, broken only by the distant sounds of workers and machinery outside. Finally, Bernard spoke again, his voice less sure, but still resigned. "I'm in. I'll help you. But this is going to cost us. We can't go back from this." Watkins nodded. "We won't go back, but we have a chance to make a real difference. We fix this, and maybe we stop a disaster. We don't fix it, and we're complicit in it." With the decision made, the group sprang into action. It was late in the evening when they began, working under dim, flickering lights. There was no room for hesitation now, no time for second-guessing. Every minute counted. Watkins led them with a quiet, focused intensity that left little space for doubt. They had only a few hours, the night, to rework the weapon's firing mechanism. They had to be precise. There could be no room for error. The men moved like clockwork, each engineer doing his part, hands steady with the knowledge that what they were doing would never be credited, never be acknowledged. They worked on borrowed time, using stolen moments from their official duties. As the night deepened, the hum of the shop became a constant rhythm, the sounds of metal against metal, the hiss of steam from the boilers, the careful clicking of tools and instruments. The shipyards outside were quiet now, their usual buzz muffled by the heavy blanket of night. As they worked, Watkins could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of their actions pressing down on him. There was no safety net here. If they failed, if their modifications didn't work, it wouldn't just be their careers on the line. It would be the men who would board the ship in a few days, unaware of the silent, ticking time bomb they were walking into. By the time the first light of dawn began to break through the workshop's grimy windows, the final adjustments were in place. Watkins stepped back and surveyed the work they had done, the strain of the past few hours written on his face, but a flicker of hope in his chest. They had done it. They had fixed the flaw. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make a difference. Enough to give the fleet a fighting chance. "All right," he said quietly, wiping his brow. "It's done. Now we just have to hope the Admiralty takes it seriously." But as he spoke, the door to the workshop creaked open, and the sound of boots on the stone floor echoed in the room. A senior officer from the fleet stood there, his face unreadable, his uniform immaculate, a sharp contrast to the grime and sweat of the engineers who had worked through the night. Watkins could feel the tension in the air. The officer stepped forward, his eyes scanning the workshop before landing on Watkins. "We've received a report about your modifications," the officer said, his voice cold. "You're to report to the Admiralty immediately." Watkins felt his heart drop. The small victory, the hours of hard work, might be about to come crashing down. The men stood frozen, their faces pale in the morning light. They had defied the system. Now, they would pay the price. September 3rd, 1942. London, England. The rain was falling in sheets as John Watkins stood at the window of the small office, the city stretching out below him, drenched in the gray light of a London morning. It had been months since the engineers' quiet rebellion, since they had worked through the night to fix the flaws in the naval guns that were about to be deployed to the front lines. In that time, the war had moved relentlessly forward, as it always did, grinding everything beneath its weight. But as Watkins stared out at the rain-slicked streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that history was passing them by, and they would be forgotten in its rush. Inside the office, the air was thick with the usual hum of bureaucracy. Papers shuffled, phones rang, and the officers of the Admiralty conducted their business as though nothing had changed. As if the fleet hadn't been saved by a group of engineers who, in the eyes of the military establishment, had no right to challenge the system. They had done what they could, had done the impossible, and yet here they were, waiting for something that would never come. Recognition. A thank you. Even the smallest acknowledgment. Watkins had tried, again and again, to get the attention of those in power. He had gone through the proper channels, filing reports, speaking to officers, making his case that the fleet had been saved by the modifications they had made. But each time, his efforts were met with silence, a polite but firm dismissal. The Admiralty had no interest in the contributions of a few engineers. The war was too big, too urgent for such trivialities. They were already moving on to the next battle, the next piece of machinery, the next victory to claim. What did the lives of a few sailors matter when weighed against the tide of history? It was then that Watkins received a summons, a letter from a high-ranking officer in the Admiralty. It was brief, to the point, and without fanfare. He was to report for a meeting that afternoon. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The letter had been too curt, too devoid of any warmth. It was an official summons, nothing more. When he arrived at the Admiralty, the building felt colder than usual, the hallways lined with officers whose faces seemed to blend into the shadows of the stone walls. He was escorted through the labyrinth of corridors to a small, sterile room, where a group of senior officers sat at a long table. They were waiting for him, their expressions unreadable, their eyes sharp and distant. "Mr. Watkins," the senior officer in charge said, his voice heavy with authority. "Thank you for joining us." Watkins stood, his hands clasped behind his back, trying to steady his nerves. He had no idea what they wanted from him. After all, they had ignored him before. What had changed? "We've reviewed your report regarding the modifications to the fleet's weaponry," the officer continued. "And we've decided that while your work was commendable, it's not something we can publicly acknowledge." Watkins' heart sank. He knew what was coming, but hearing it aloud made the truth feel more brutal than he had imagined. "I see," he said, his voice tight. "So what now? You'll simply carry on as if nothing happened?" The officer didn't flinch. "You must understand, Mr. Watkins, that the nature of war requires a certain flexibility. We can't afford to make waves over something like this. The fleet is still at sea. We can't risk giving the impression that the naval guns were ever anything less than perfect." Watkins felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat. "Perfect," he echoed. "Is that what you think? Do you really believe that the work we did was perfect? That the lives we saved don't matter?" The officer's eyes narrowed. "This is not about perfection. It's about maintaining morale. We cannot afford to acknowledge any flaws in our equipment at this stage in the war. We have to project strength, not weakness." Watkins stood there, silent for a long moment, trying to process the absurdity of it all. The lives of hundreds, maybe thousands of sailors have been saved by the work they did, by the hours spent in the shadows, away from the glory of the war effort. And now, it would be as if it had never happened. The officers around the table exchanged looks, their faces impassive, their hands resting on the table in front of them like statues. The decision had been made. There was no room for argument.